Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who is a 4 times combat veteran and host of the very popular Daniel Davis Deep Dive YouTube program. So thank you very much for coming back on.
Always my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So your military background and expertise comes, well, in good hand now, as we see that Pokrovsk has fallen much faster than expected. As I understand, there's only a few more streets left, and so over 95% has been taken already by the Russians, and what many assumed would take weeks or even months more happened seemingly in a few days. So one of the consequences, though, is that thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were not pulled out, and as we see from footage, many people are surrendering. Other Ukrainian soldiers are simply being slaughtered as they attempt to escape, while other has retreated into Mirinograd, which is now completely encircled. I guess, how did this happen? How did the city fall to the Russians so fast? And why are all these troops still there?
Yeah, this has been going on for quite a long time. The end has come fast, but the investment in the siege, you could say, has been going on for probably over a year. And for really I guess about 2 months ago, from 2 months to 1 month ago, there was just a little bit of progress, which it's been kind of the case before because Russia had been variously going back and forth between different parts of the front. They had been using different tactics, etc. But one of the things that led to the success here is that Russia has been increasing the pace of its operations at multiple points along the front lines. I mean, all the way down into the Kherson area, the Zaporizhia area, just south of the Pokrovsk area, just north in Konstantinivka, then up in the Liman area, and then in the Kupiansk area. And then even additional stuff is just late, even in the Kharkiv Oblast as well. They've been increasing operations there. Russia has the manpower to do all that, so they have been increasing in each of those places. Ukraine hasn't. And I think the one thing this really exposed, and I'm pretty sure it was by design, is that the Ukraine side didn't have the reinforcements necessary to be able to keep all of the holes plugged and to reinforce in the area when Russia clearly made Pokrovsk its priority of effort several months ago. I actually interviewed one of a guy from the Russian side who told me, I want to say it was about 4 months ago, that Pokrovsk was definitely their priority of efforts. It was able to say that even out loud in public. And what you saw was, you may recall, I think it was in August, that Russia had this really big penetration up north of Pokrovsk, north of Rodinska, the city that's kind of at the linchpin of the mouth of the what had been the cauldron set up over the Pokrovsk area. And Ukraine rushed the last of its theater reserves into that area to check that penetration, because there was some concern at the time, which I had, that Russia may use that penetration to actually use more exploitation forces and to just penetrate into the rear. Ukraine obviously thought that same thing, and that they sent what was their last theater level reserves, the Azov Corps, to check that penetration, and then they had been trying to cut that penetration off and push it back to where it was. Well, in so focusing on there, what they didn't do was focus on the Pokrovsk area because they didn't have the troops. Russia did have the troops there, and so they started accelerating their movement into the Pokrovsk area at the same time of those other ones that I mentioned, so that Ukraine couldn't pull a fire brigade away from a slower portion of the front to man that hole. So they only had one place to use it, and that was north of the Pokrovsk area, north of Rodinska. And they'd had some limited tactical success there. That's true. But they don't have the manpower to even complete that one right there. And now then you see that has come at the expense of the virtual total loss of Pokrovsk. And as you pointed out, from that Rodinska area and now from the south end in Pokrovsk, they have actually met up and they have now closed the gap. And so now the troops in Mironograd, and then in the southern part, there's some forested areas there south of Mironograd. Those are now completely surrounded. So Russia is able to increase the pace of its aerial assault. The drone strikes have continued on. I've seen some reports here just earlier today that the drone saturation is just off the charts. The Russia's not having to use its manpower. They're not having to do these claimed meat wave assaults that they really probably never did, at least not in the last couple of years anyway. But now then they're using their troops even less and leading with a lot more firepower because they have it. And that is just pummeling the Ukraine side. And now then that they're cut off, they don't have any reinforcements to come in. They can't get medical support out. The only way they can reinforce them is to have some of those big Baba Yaga drones or any of the other kinds where they can bring supplies in. But that's spotty. It's limited, and it's also under fire from the Russian side. And had been talking about and watching this as that mall was closing, that Ukraine had a decision point to make. They could either do the same thing they did early in the war in Mariupol. They could repeat what they did in Lysychansk, in Severodonetsk, in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, where they said, no, we are not going to give up anything. We're not going to withdraw to better lines, which made sense militarily. And just kind of as a side, there was the option in almost all of those places I just mentioned to where you could have, once it became untenable and the Russians had gotten into a certain area, especially in the outskirts of the town, you could have withdrawn under fire and in order to a previously prepared defensive positions from which then you could make it a lot more expensive on the Russians to make any more incursions forward. The worst thing you can do is to stay in those positions because now that it's easier for the Russian offensive guys to make their penetrations because they can use the buildings themselves as cover to get right up on top of you, which is exactly what happened. And by refusing to withdraw from all those other places, and you have to add Kursk into that, Ukraine then sacrificed tens of thousands of troops and lost the territory too. So they gave up the military advantage they could have had by doing it right, and they lost the troops. So it's the worst of all possibilities. Heading into Pokrovsk, I said, you've got a capability to do that here and in Kupiansk in the north. And if you don't withdraw their troops while you have the chance, then you're going to lose the town and you're going to lose the troops. And now it appears that they have lost that chance, and that's the only one they got left now is to try to escape from Kupiansk, because now then there's just no path out for the Ukraine side. So now then they're being killed in large numbers, even trying to get out, and there's nothing to hold on. There's no value whatsoever in hanging on to Mirnograd if you can't get troops in or medical supports out. So it's the worst of all options, and the Ukraine side has just really ruined its own opportunities here.
Yeah, it's some gruesome photos that are coming out. Not just the soldiers from Mirnograd trying to escape the pocket, which are being, I guess, killed on the way trying to leave, but also the predictable efforts to unblock the encirclement of these troops. They had to cross fields more or less, and the Russians, saw this coming. So even the unblocking forces took huge casualties as well. And even though they didn't achieve their stated objective, but on the manpower issue, it seems the drone warfare changed some of the dynamics, because it seems the more troops you have now, often in one team, the easier it is to be discovered. So you saw these groups and 2 or 3 Russian soldiers penetrating these different gaps in the Ukrainian defenses, and again, it happened so fast. But how do you make sense of some of these statements coming out, though? Why they, for example, Zelensky, he made some very bold statements that the Russians, only a few Russians were in Pokrovsk, even as the entire city has now been taken, and Ukraine is still in control. I mean, this is some pretty wild stuff, but the media seems to be playing along. It's how do you make sense of this?
Well, the Western media seems to be playing along because that's just what they reflexively do. They just are unwilling to acknowledge what's actually happening on the ground, even though the numbers are playing out there. And Zelensky is just saying, "Oh, well, there's not that many troops in there." I think he said 60 were in Kupiansk, which is even more absurd. And we'll see probably that operation accelerate now as well here in the coming weeks. But that's what Russia has gone forward. because they're leading with firepower and they're leading with drones, they're leading with FAB bombs, they're leading with missiles. They're still continuing with the artillery, which is still its part. They're using fire control from direct fire systems like tank fire, etc. They have all the categories that they need, and so they don't need. It would be foolish to lead with large numbers of troops. That's just how this war has played out. And anyone who uses large numbers on any side of this fight will have large casualties if they do, but if you have these small groups, and that was one of the reports that I saw about 2 or 3 weeks ago from the Ukraine side, that they were, I don't know if you were complaining about it, but they were acknowledging that there's just so many of these small 2 and 3 man Russian forces that they move into certain parts of the town. So now that you if you bring, a lot of concentrated fire to bear, all you're going to get is a couple of guys, and you've used a lot of ammunition. But the Russians have dispersed all their guys, and so they take all of these places. They know that several of the places there were Ukrainian pockets that they bypassed and to moved around, but now then they're cut off. So now that they can either methodically destroy them, because once these small groups are in there, they can find out where the Ukrainian side are, and they can vector in artillery strikes. They can bring in, drones themselves, or FAB bombs can be directed on target for the Russian air power, and then they're methodically destroyed. So it doesn't matter what the actual number of Russian troops was. If it was, I mean, I can't imagine it was literally only 250 guys, but it could well have been because of the dispersion, because the power of those guys is much greater than the actual numbers. And then you see on the map that they succeeded in really fast. Once it was pretty slow up to about a month or so ago, but then really fast up to this point, because the weakening had just finally started to collapse and to crumble. And then we've seen it roll up, and now then the whole conglomeration is physically surrounded. And now then we'll see what's going to happen with Mirnograd after that. But that's what's actually going on.
Well, we've seen throughout this war that often Zelensky has chosen to trade lives for time. That is, to hold on to cities after they've been lost, and the casualty ratios shift
Yeah,
in
but
their
Brad, I just
disfavor.
want to comment on that, because that is one of the more aggravating and annoying things to me, and just angering on the sense of how it just throws away human life. Because I've heard that. Well, he traded time for space, because that is in isolation legitimate potential military strategy. Only though if it actually accomplishes and buys you some kind of advantage to do. What the Ukraine side has done is that they have thrown away lives for nothing. And sure, the time clicked off the clock, and for example, in Bakhmut, by making the Russians go building by building and sometimes floor by floor to eject all of the Ukrainians, they did lose a lot of people. The Russians did, and actually it was more the Wagner group than it was the Russian army per se, and they did lose a lot of guys. But you lost the city and all of your guys. Look, on the other hand, at what the Russians did in Kherson City in 2022. They were faced with a similar situation. They had, I think it was about 40,000, 30 to 40,000 troops in the city of Kherson. It was one of the bigger captures that they made in the war on a large city. They were faced with, do we continue to hold it, because the Ukraine side was moving in from the west and they were moving towards it? Do they fight and defend the city, or do they abandon the city and withdraw all those troops on the other side of the Dnipro River and hand over it so the Ukraine can take it without fighting? But they have preserved all of their troops, which is what they chose to do, because they said it would cost too much to hold on to it. So instead of giving time or anything else, they just abandoned the city. They blew all the bridges across the Dnipro. So it now basically stopped the Ukraine. They couldn't go any further, but all of those troops, all of those experienced and combat trained up troops survived. And now then they can use them elsewhere, and they build other formations off of them. But the Ukraine side in the Kursk area, when they had a similar situation, once they had that first penetration in August of last year, and they went up, quite a ways in, that's all they could have done. They didn't have the power to push up any further, and it was never going to go further. They should have said, "Okay, now we're going to withdraw all of our troops, and we're going to live to fight another day. We had our say. We took it to Russia. We blew up a bunch of stuff, and yay, that was great. Whatever." But we're going to seal that thing off. Now you would have had all those troops, but as it is, they lost 70,000 troops, and they kept putting in more and more reinforcements. And now you're paying the price for what they did in Kursk, because all those guys they could have saved, and it could have been on the Eastern Front to make this Pokrovsk even more difficult for Russia to take. They didn't have them. So now that they just got whoever they can steal off the streets, and they've lost all of that troops they had here, and they lost the territory. So they lost it all. So you traded some time, you got 7 months, but what did you get for that? You lost your most trained troops, and you can't replace trained guys. Guys who've been around for years of this war or even longer than that in some of the cases, they're gone and you've lost all their experience with them. And now then you may have more guys you put in uniform, but they aren't trained in experience, and you can't build experience. It's only got to be earned day by day. And just putting somebody else in uniform may keep the numbers similar, but their capability is far less. And now you're seeing it manifest, and at some point, I think what we've seen happen in Pokrovsk is going to happen probably on the Eastern Front somewhere, and there's probably going to be a collapse. It's possible that, especially as we get further into winter here, that we could have a collapse somewhere on a portion of the front, not just a city, but on a portion of the front. Remains to be seen what the Russians will do with that, but that's a big risk that because the Ukraine side tried to quote trade time for space and ended up losing all of it.
Yeah, you mentioned Kursk. This is one of the many strange things in this war. I mean, when they went in, many of us were saying this makes no sense. They put their best men from, behind the defensive lines in the trenches where they're protected out in the open, and tens of thousands of them, young men, were slaughtered. Good soldiers, which the Ukrainians had. And what is the point of this? They can't possibly hold it. Yet any dissent, any criticism was just denounced as, oh, well, that's a Kremlin talking point. But forwarding to now, the present time, nothing was achieved. They took massive casualties. They were chasing out, but there's no reflection, because anything that disrupts the war narrative that this everything is brilliant and any offensive is a good thing, it prevents this. But with though the collapse of Pokrovsk now, this is a very strategic city. Though, what are the consequences of this city falling to the Russians?
Well, I mean, there's a it's a double-edged sword, and both edges are against the Ukraine side because it is a tremendous morale destroyer for the Ukraine side because their troops now see again that their command does not prioritize their lives. And instead of giving the order, when I was talking about when that mall was closing and it was still open, you could have gotten those guys out. They could have been brought to safety, lived to fight another day from stronger defensive positions where they could have imposed a higher cost on the Russians to advance. But instead, whether it's Sersky or Zelensky or the other commanders, they did not prioritize their lives. And now that they have allowed them to die in place, and there's some number of thousands of them that are completely behind enemy lines and surrounded now and will either be captured and sent to POW camps or they'll be killed in place. And so just imagine if you're let's say you're in Kupiansk and say you're in some of those other areas up there or in the Volchansk up in the Kharkiv area. You're like, well, what's going to happen if I get surrounded? My own people are going to allow me to just die in place for nothing. And if I can look and see you died for nothing in Avdiivka, in Bakhmut, in Kursk, in Krinky down on the Dnipro River before that, or in now Pokrovsk, why do I want to literally die for nothing when I know that my own country is just going to continue to blindly throw lives into the toilet? I just, at some point, even the most ardent nationalists are going to say, there's no point in this. I mean, we've already seen the desertions are up, according to one report I saw in so far through 10 plus months of 2025, 500,000 people have deserted. And another couple of 100,000 ages 18 to 22 have fled the country just the last 2 months on that portion of it. And you can see at some point people are going to look around and go, I'm just going to join that group here. This is suicide to stay here, and nobody wants to commit suicide.
Yeah, I follow quite a few of these Ukrainian Telegram channels of different, military people from the Ukrainian side, and the there's the decline in morale is quite obvious, and also anger often among their own political and military leadership. It stands in very stark contrast, though, to what you see often from Western politicians and media, where there's insist no surrender, no withdrawal, no negotiations. If they listen to this military telegram channels of Ukrainians, they would probably call them Putinists for challenging the wisdom of holding on to every single inch despite all this massive losses.
Well, there was a speech given at Maastricht University on the 3rd of November, so just a few days ago, by General Ben Hodges, and I think that he gave the view that a lot of people where he took President Trump to task and said he has had a losing strategy from the beginning. He said he doesn't understand anything about the history of the war, which is kind of odd because I don't know what history he's talking about here. But he said that he implied that he could have just given Putin an order to leave. He said he didn't even tell Russia to leave Ukraine, and he now asked Ukraine to give up territory to get peace, and that's ridiculous, he says. So Russia is not winning. General Jack Keane on Fox News yesterday said Russia is not winning. So we just need to put more ammunition, more weapons, etc., in there, oblivious to everything we just talked about on the map and all the men that are dying and the people that are abandoning the fight. And like, no, just keep giving them more bullets to go in and keep dying. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. And especially in light of all these failures that have happened in the last year or so, why would you want to say, yeah, let's just keep on helping them die in large numbers when we see it's not going to work? And the Russian side does have all the numbers, and they have the ammunition and the industrial capacity, which I think you mentioned a second ago. And then you can say we can't just tell Russia to leave because we can't make them leave, and yet that passes for elite thinking in the West. And it just puzzles me why we keep going down, why we keep listening to people like that. To be honest with you.
Yeah, I've seen Ben Hodges contribute on different programs, and I'm always struck by the thought that if this were our men, our soldiers, we would have taken very, very different decisions. But
One
again,
would
the
hope.
more they keep waving the Ukrainian flags, the more the dishonest they seem. That these are mere lives to be thrown away. But you did mention these other cities which are falling because Pokrovsk has already fallen. Siversk is now semi-encircled, and also the Russians seems to have entered in the south. Kupiansk also encircled. You can add the Konstantinivka as well, but combined, these are very important cities along the main front line where all the defenses are. But together as well, if you look at Russia's key objective of taking Donetsk, then the two main cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, then Pokrovsk is just in the southwest, which allows them to push north and cover the cities from the west. Siversk is on the western side, Kupiansk is in the north, you have Konstantinovka in the south. If they take all the cities which are now being entered or encircled, all of them, these two huge cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk could be encircled. I wouldn't say easy, it will take a while and of course both blood and time. But that being said, do you see this intensifying, a wider collapse in Ukraine? Because even if it wasn't that strategic, which it's very strategic, but even if it wasn't, the loss of all this manpower, it makes the next battle so much more difficult.
Right, and see, that's why I specifically mentioned how this one of Pokrovsk played out, because you saw that Ukraine already used its last strategic theater reserves to try and to unblock that area in the northern part, north of Pokrovsk, which they didn't succeed at doing. And because they did that, they didn't have the troops down in the Kherson region. They didn't have it in the region just south of Pokrovsk, and they didn't have it in the city itself. So they had to pick and choose, and they lost here. And because all these other fights that you just mentioned there in Liman, in also Seversk, and then in Kupiansk, because those are also simultaneously going on, the Ukraine just doesn't have enough manpower to be able to fight effectively in all of them. So they're starting to lose in virtually all of them, and especially where Russia focuses, puts a priority of effort, they're able to take that. So once they've completed the Pokrovsk and the Mirnograd circle, once that's taken care of, then all of those troops now can be applied elsewhere, and something else will move to the priority. Maybe at Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, as you just mentioned there. And the problem is that now then Ukraine has even less troops. I mean, they could, in all total, it'll probably be a total of about 10,000 lost in this one pocket by itself. And I'm not sure how many are in Kupiansk, but a pretty solid number on top of that. Now then you have even less troops to go in to defend those two borders and those other two towns. And the bottom line is, at some point, it's just math. you're going to run out of troops and you're not going to be able to cover the front. Russia can. And at some point, you're just going to have a collapse at the front. There's just not enough men. And it's just inevitable. I don't know. It could literally be a year from now before that happens. I don't know. It could also be a month from now. It could happen before Christmas. But it is inevitable that it's going to happen. And the longer we go on pretending that mathematics don't apply and that you can continue to just have people slaughtered and there's never going to be a break, is just rolling the dice for no value whatsoever, because it's going to happen at some point, Glenn.
And whatever deal the Russians have, if we think they're harsh terms now, and I would fall in that category who thinks that terms are harsh, but they will only become much, much worse, I guess, once the strategic advantage increases on the Russian side. Just a quick last question, though. As we now moving towards this more and more desperate situation for NATO and Zelensky, do you think there's any risk or chance that Europeans especially might, but of course Trump as well, might escalate in some way in an effort to rescue the situation? Because it seems a dangerous thing to do, because the Russians seems to have run out of patience and desperate to restore their deterrence. So there seems to be a dangerous dynamic here building up.
Yeah, I perceive that that's one of the reasons why Russia chose now to test its Pokrovsk missile, what it claims is this nuclear-powered, nuclear-tipped cruise missile. Why it chose now to do the Poseidon missile, etc., reinforcing that they have the Sarmat, is specifically saying it by name and talking about the Oreshnik and how they're operational now, etc. I think to say, don't test us. Uh, you have Mark Rutte earlier today in Romania was talking about, yeah, yep, we are definitely going to defend every inch of NATO territory. And if anything happens, we'll have fleets of F-35s come flying in and all these battle tanks and everything like that. And Russia's listening to that and they're going, I wouldn't do that. And by the way, we're building up our forces too. And the way that they're doing now with their reserves and their recruitment folks that they bring in, and their conscripts, etc., they've changed the way they're doing it. So now they're building up about 3 million reserves that could be called upon on short notice. They're building up their reserves of all of these categories of drones, whether the Garans, the missiles, the artillery shells, refurbished tanks, other armored personnel carriers. Most of those are going into storage that they're rebuilding, because they're not using as many on the front lines now because they don't need to, because I think they're telling everybody, whether it's operational or strategic, we are superior militarily, and if you test us, it won't go well. And so don't test us. And instead, let's end this war. And let's get back to looking for security for everybody. Russia still is saying that. And I want to reemphasize something that you just said a minute ago, because it's really important. The terms right now that for a negotiated settlement are still on the table, and they are, I call them ugly. The ugly terms, they're terrible from Ukraine's perspective, but they're not as bad as killing all the rest of their troops and taking everything up to the Dnieper River, and probably including Odessa up to the Transnistria, because I think all of that could fall too. So it can get much, much worse if Russia is required to take on the battlefield what they would otherwise settle for less on a negotiation table. And I think Russia is saying, look at what we're doing and look at what we have done and look at how this side is crumbling. Don't press a bad situation further. End it now. That's what we should do. We're given a golden opportunity here. And I just pray to God that we have the wisdom to take it, because if we don't, Glenn, you're going to get that situation that I just described there. Russia will take everything that they want on the battlefield, however long it takes.
Yeah, I get the impression though that Europeans might be uh, well, enhancing the rhetoric to some extent to make up for the fact that the U.S. is reducing its military presence now in Central and Eastern Europe. So to compensate for the reduced capabilities, there's more, beating the chest and yeah, speaking loud. But
And that's the opposite of what we should be doing. We should say, hey, look at that. Let's start going towards diplomacy, something that can actually produce positive outcomes, that can ensure your security, your prosperity, and the safety of all the people, and lower the chances of war. That's the wise thing to do. And I guess because the mentality has just been locked in this thing really since 1992, and and all the way since 2022, well, 2014, let's just go back to there. I guess they just have this ossified brain cells, if that's a whole thing, that they can't think in ways that are rational and protective of their own interest. But I hope we figure out how to do that before it's too late.
Well, I wish NATO would give you a call for some advice there, because there seems to be a lack of common sense now. But thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're busy, so very much appreciate it.
Always my pleasure, Glenn. Thanks for having me.